Professor Chin, is an honor having you here. Professor Danilo, thanks for support this interview. Thank you, Professor Keino Gracia. Thank you, Professor Walter Canelli. Thank you, Professor Gregor Garibaldi. So, Professor Tim, let's start with a more or less biographical question. What was the theoretical context of your formation as a philosopher? How do you think this context influenced the issues you have most dedicated yourself to your career?
Okay, so I was a student at Oxford University in the 1970s. I did my undergraduate degree in mathematics and philosophy, and then I did my doctorate in philosophy. So the prevailing, as it were, philosophical environment was in analytic philosophy, and because as an undergraduate I was studying mathematics and philosophy, I did a lot of logic as part of that, which has certainly been very important to me throughout my career. So that's the very general kind of context. The two important philosophers who were around at that time. One was Michael Dummett, who was in some ways the most influential philosopher in Oxford in the sort of areas that I was interested in, and who later supervised me for the final year of my doctorate. And so there was a lot of discussion of the dispute between realism and anti-realism, which he made central to. Oh, sorry. So something happened with the screen. I'm sorry about that. You'll have to cut that bit out. So he made the dispute between realism and anti-realism central to philosophy, and unlike Dummett, my sympathies were very much on the realist side, but I also later came to feel that in a way the arguments on the anti-realist side were comparatively weak, and so this wasn't the right sort of issue to focus philosophy on. And although some of my earlier work was in a way attacking anti-realism, a lot of the time since then I've been more sort of disposed to treat it as clear that some kind of realism is correct, and then go on from there. But I mean, in a way, the philosopher who influenced me more was Saul Kripke, who was giving visiting lectures, the John Locke lectures at Oxford in my very first term as an undergraduate, and I was very impressed by the way he approached philosophy, the combination of logical rigor and common sense and a sense of humor, and so he to the extent that I had a model of how to do philosophy, that it was more like Kripke than like Dummett.
Professor Chin, another biographical question, especially for general public, introduction your thinking. What have been the main changes in your thinking from the 1990s to the present?
So, I mean, I think there's been more change in my sort of area of interest than in my actual views. But I mean, the views have changed a little bit. I mean, one change is to do with a sort of rather technical issues about, well, partly about concepts that for a long time I was sort of brought up to think of philosophy in terms of concepts, and and increasingly, I've found that the term concept is too unclear to be very useful in philosophy, and I certainly I've for a long time I've been very skeptical of the idea of conceptual analysis, but now I try to avoid talk of concepts altogether, because I think that's actually a rather obscure way of framing issues. And so, and that, whereas in my earlier work, I was more willing to talk it in terms of concepts, I think there have been ways in which I've moved position on what I take to be the nature of the contents of thought and of speech, that I used to think of those in as having something a little bit like this kind of structure that sentences of a language have, whereas now I'm inclined to think that what's called the very coarse-grained way of thinking of contents as just something like sets of possible worlds. It's actually has more explanatory power than the more fine-grained ways which I used to prefer, and in a way my views have been moving in the opposite direction to that from which a lot of the philosophical community has been going, as where they've been becoming more fine-grained while I've been becoming more coarse-grained.
So, Professor Tim, I have a question about proposition model logic. There are many systems of model logic, even if we restrict ourselves to normal systems. Professor Tim, do you have any opinion on whether there is correct system, and what does correct mean here?
Yeah. So, of course, modal logic, just as a branch of logic, doesn't imply any particular interpretation of the modal operators, is the box and the diamond, and so I think if you don't specify how these new operators are to be interpreted, then there's no possibility of fixing. I mean, it doesn't make any sense to fix on one system as being correct, because there are just many different interpretations, and which system is correct depends on which interpretation you're interested in. But for example, once you have fixed on an interpretation, that a sense in which the box means necessarily, and a sense in which the diamond means possibly, then I think that there always is a single correct system for that sense of the operators, because it will just be the system which consists of all and only the principles. I mean, if you like, the formulas that are correct. That to come out that are true. However you interpret the non logical constants in them, which basically just means however you interpret the atomic formulas. And then, for example, I'm inclined to think that if you interpret the box as meaning metaphysical necessity and the diamond as meaning metaphysical possibility, then the correct system is the one known as S5. But if you give them different interpretations, a different system may turn out to be correct.
Thank you, Professor Tim. Professor Tim, I was reading your text to reply Quickfine's work. I have two questions. First, in the nutshell, why model logic is metaphysics, and what is the importance of Quickfine's work in model logic as metaphysics, and what are the criticisms of his proposals?
Oh, so I think that modal logic is metaphysics if you give an interpretation of the modal operators that is metaphysically interesting, and the most obvious one is when you interpret them as meaning metaphysical necessity and metaphysical possibility, and then the way in which it's metaphysics is that the theorems of the correct system are basically true universal principles of a very general structural kind about metaphysical modality and how it interacts with conjunction and disjunction and negation, and these are not principles about language or anything, and they're not, these are not principles that, as it were, anybody who understands them is kind of thereby is going to accept or anything. Like, these are things which can be argued about, and so it seems to me that the right way to take them is as very, very general claims about how the world is, and claims of a general structural kind, and that seems like very much what metaphysics is supposed to be concerned with.
So,
And then you wanted to ask about Kit Fine. So Kit Fine did a lot of work on modal logic, particularly in the 1970s and 80s, and some of that has been was technical, pretty much mathematical work, which was a seminal in the development of modal logic as a discipline, a branch of mathematical logic. And I think even when he was working on somewhat more metaphysical questions in modal logic, he was, a lot of the work that he was doing in that period was really trying to show what the possible theories were, how different formal theories would correspond to different understandings of properties and relations and so on, and so I think that was all extremely valuable work, and in a way fairly open as to what the correct philosophical views were, but just concerned with how these different competing views might be developed in a technically rigorous way. I think the kind of disagreements between Kit and me, I mean, we know each other well, we're good friends, but the disagreements have more to do with his later work, where he's arguing that the kind of distinctions that are made in modal logic are too coarse to capture a lot of things of metaphysical interest. Like, for example, even the idea of an essential property, which Kripke gave some account of in modal terms in his book Naming and Necessity, and then Kit has argued that account is wrong because there are just subtle distinctions which you can't capture if you just work in terms of modal logic, and that's where I'm much more skeptical, because although I think the kind of arguments that Kit gives have a very strong initial appeal, I think one can show that there are analogous arguments to them where it's clear that the arguments, there must be something wrong with them because they lead to inconsistencies, and I think what's going on there is some of the, I mean, it's not some of the judgments that the arguments are based on about particular examples, which are meant to be counterexamples to a treatment of essentiality in terms of modal logic. I mean, they're really the products of heuristics that the humans are equipped with, and that these heuristics are, I mean, they're kind of like quick and dirty ways of answering questions of certain kinds, and although they're reliable on the whole, then they're also somewhat fallible, and I think one can argue pretty plausibly that these arguments are actually trading on cases in which we wouldn't expect these heuristics to be giving correct results. And so I'm actually much more hopeful than Kit is that modal logic itself can do an awful lot of the work in philosophy, and that we don't need to replace it by some much more fine-grained framework.
Professor Ting, painting quantifiers to model logic bring a host and technical and philosophical problems. What do you think are the greatest challenges for first order in model logic?
Well, I mean, I think first order modal logic, I think, is reasonably well understood from a technical point of view. I mean, of course, with any branch of logic, there are always unanswered questions. But I think on the whole, the unanswered questions, are more of mathematical than of philosophical interest. But I mean, there are still some that have not been very fully dealt with. So that, for example, if you interpret the modal operators in an epistemic way as standing for something like knowledge or belief, I mean, as what people might call epistemic or doxastic necessity, then although a lot of work has been done on just the purely propositional branch of epistemic modal logic, actually very little has been done on the quantified, even just the first order quantified version. And I think the main reason is that it's just not really clear how to handle Frege puzzles in like the case of Hesperus and Phosphorus, where you're talking about the same thing and but under different descriptions, and where and so that people don't realize that it's the same thing. And it turns out that those kind of puzzles are very important to the interpretation of the quantifiers in epistemic modal logic, and so that's a kind of area where not very much is understood, and it's a mixture of, I think it's in a way it's a more philosophical than technical issue, but it has to do with finding a way of interpreting the interaction of quantifiers like every and some with the epistemic modal operators like no, that gives you a workable system. So I mean, that's one area in which seems that one would like to see more development.
Professor Tim, in model logic as metaphysics, you defend a form of actualism. would this a very strong metaphysical position, Professor King? Why and what are the advantages of accepting that the Bacon formula is correct in addition to make calculations simpler?
Yeah. So it isn't just a matter of making it the logic computationally easier. It's really that you know, if we're interested in the correct system of quantified modal logic under a metaphysical interpretation of the modal operators as standing for metaphysical necessity and metaphysical possibility, then things like the Barkan formula and its converse and other potential theorems are really they're making metaphysical claims of a theoretical kind. Um, and the kind of methodology that's appropriate for assessing them um, is not so different from the kind of methodology which is appropriate for deciding between um, different theories in natural science when they're of a very theoretical nature. And so, I mean, there's on the one hand, we obviously these theories need to be consistent with our evidence, and in modal logic we do have evidence in the sense of that we start off with a fair bit of knowledge about modality, because we know that there are things that that we can do but won't do, and so on. So we know that, which is already an example of contingency. Um, and so beyond just the consistency with evidence, we're comparing theories by what's known as an abductive methodology, where we're looking for, well, I mean, very simple way of putting it is as this simpler, I mean, the best combination of strength and simplicity. I mean, that's, as we're a kind of very crude version of it, but this corresponds to the way in which scientists, on the one hand, they want theories that actually answer their questions, and so have to be informative and in that sense strong, that they imply a lot in order to give answers to the questions. But they also want theories which are not ad hoc, which are as far as possible simple and elegant. And the same criteria apply in as with this, an area of logic where things are reasonably speculative, as in metaphysically interpreted modal logic. And so both the strength of the principles like the Barkan formula that you mentioned, and the fact that they lead to a simple logic, it's not just a computational advantage. It means that we're dealing with a logic that has, by ordinary scientific standards, the right kind of virtues. It's an excellent combination of simplicity and strength, and that's a reason for taking it very seriously as an answer to our questions.
So we are talking about modal logic and how it's central to philosophy. Not only modal logic, but the whole notion of metaphysical modality. But it does not seem to me that metaphysical modality has a lot of role outside philosophy. So why do you think that creatures like us should have any faculty to know model facts?
Yes. So so I agree that in everyday life, and the knowing facts about metaphysical possibility is not important, and and so there was, if you like, there was no evolutionary pressure on us to become good at answering questions like that. But I think the key is to understand metaphysical modality as just a kind of limiting case of objective modality more generally, where objective modality has to do with what, for example, what we can do. And so it's an objective matter. I mean, whether you can, whether you can run a mile in 4 minutes or something is I mean, that's just an objective fact about your abilities. It's not to do with whether it's sort of, as people would say, logically possible for you to do it. It's to do with whether you actually, as you are, have that physical capacity. And it's very important for us, for all sorts of practical reasons, to know what we can do and what we can't do, and what other people can do and or can't do. And as well, we need to have a sense of our strengths and limitations, and and in order that we that we don't undertake projects which have no possibility of working out, and that we do things that will improve our lives, that we're capable of doing. And so I think we need to have, for practical reasons, we have to be able to engage with some various kinds of objective possibility. It's not just what it might be the case for all we know, but what we actually are, can do. And I think another way in which we deal with counterfactual matters, that with things that could have been otherwise, is with counterfactual conditionals, where we talk about what would have been the case if we'd done something differently. And there's psychological evidence that kind of thinking is relevant to learning from our mistakes. That if we're able to reflect on something that we did that turned out badly, and we realize that if we had done things differently, they would have turned out better, then we can that will improve our performance next time with a bit of luck. And so there's lots of practical reasons for us to be able to think in terms of as possibilities and counterfactual conditionals of a restricted kind. And then I think that the metaphysical kinds of possibility are just really taking that to the limit, where we lift all the sort of restrictions that we're imposing when we talk about what we're capable of doing. And I think that, I mean, in fact, one can give some arguments for this, that if you have a creature that is able to think about, for example, about counterfactual conditionals, about how things would have been if something else had been different, and so on, then that actually gives them the capacity, in principle, to deal with the metaphysical possibilities, which are to do with what could have been the case versus what would not have been the case, however things had been. And and so I think that as we're getting this philosophical ability to deal with the metaphysical modality as a kind of unintended byproduct of something that is of much more practical value. And I think this this also applies to logic, so that there are obvious practical reasons for being able to make logical inferences from stuff that if you know that let's say the creature that you're hunting, it could have gone this way or it could have gone that way, but you also know that it didn't go this way, then you can conclude that it must have gone that way. And so there's a practical value in in being able to make correct deductions. There's no particular practical value in knowing pure logical truths, like everything is identical with itself, or everything either is or isn't or whatever. But once if you have enough ability to do the deductions in logic, so that enables you to deduce stuff from ordinary everyday things that that will in fact also give you the ability to deal with logical truths, even though they themselves are not of practical interest. And so I think it's a story along those lines that explains why philosophers are actually able to, in a sensible way to reason about metaphysical possibility and about logical truth, even though those are things that in themselves are not of any particular practical importance.
Quick question. So we are talking about the counterfactual faculty, and it seems to me that an important role of a counterfactual faculty is to deal with, is to hold the causal laws fixed, right? So it's not that this is not something that we do like when you're thinking about metaphysical possibility. So would that be one form of like limiting case? Like the limit case is to change the causal rules?
Yeah, I mean, so of course, if we're talking about pre-scientific thinking, then at that level, people don't know very much in the way of causal laws, but they certainly do have expectations about the physical world, such as what will happen if you're holding a stone and then you let go of it. I mean, that it'll go down rather than up, and so on. And so those are things that we can vary a lot just in practical thinking, because even in practical thinking, we're often dealing with stuff whose causal powers we don't really know. I mean, we're dealing with some new plant, and we don't know whether it'll cause us to to become sick, whether it'll poison us or whether it'll nourish us, and so on. So that we've got to be able to deal with a whole ranges of possibilities that are may not be physically possible in some cases, but that that we at least have to be able to think about, because we don't really know what the causal laws are. And so I think that kind of flexibility that we need to have, just because we're not already omniscient about the causal laws, is something that will can enable us to think about how things could have been if the world had operated according to different causal laws from its actual ones.
Okay, so we were talking about this counterfactual faculty, and we are somehow basing our model knowledge on this faculty. And I find it's very interesting that this is a faculty that, in one hand, we can use from our armchair, but it is not a full a prioristic faculty. So do you think that could be like a middle ground between like more traditional way of seeing philosophy and a more scientific way of seeing philosophy?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, so the thing is, when we're sitting in the armchair, it's not as though the act of sitting down in an armchair suddenly makes us ignorant of the world that we live in, and we have we have a lot of well, if we're talking at the, as it were, just at the pre-scientific stage, we already have lots of capacities for forming expectations about how things work in the physical world, which have to do with our default ways of imagining things. Because although of course, when you can imagine that when you let go of a stone, it'll go up rather than down. But the default way of imagining it is as falling down, and so those kind of default means of imagining things are, in a way, they're already to some extent informed by experience and maybe also by innate knowledge, and so they're still available to us in the armchair, so that although we're not actually going out and doing experiments, we're what we are able, we're using some kind of knowledge that we already have of the world in thinking through the consequences of various scenarios. And of course, in physics, people have used thought experiments for a long time. I mean, Galileo and Einstein and so on. So I don't think there's any very clear line between philosophers' use of thought experiments and physicists' use of them.
Okay. Yeah, I agree. I liked your answer. So we have talked about modal logic as metaphysics. I believe a little bit about philosophy of philosophy too. So let's talk about your other books. So it has been 24 years from knowledge and its limits. And the most remembered part of this book is the knowledge first thesis, right? So I would like you to comment about the reception of this thesis from the past 20 years.
Yeah, so that thesis is really, it's in part, it's a protest about the order of explanation that epistemologists had been using, that they were trying to explain knowledge in terms of belief, which I think is getting things the wrong way round. I mean, to be honest, when the book was published, I wasn't sure that it was going to have a very large impact, because I wasn't sure to what extent people would get the alternative picture that I was offering. But I must say I've been very pleasantly surprised by how much impact it has had. Although I think a lot of very traditionally minded epistemologists have never quite managed to internalize what this alternative picture is. And I think at a more fundamental level, it's a view about really about the nature of mind, because if you ask what's the what's the point of having a mind, in a way, from I guess from a biological point of view, the point of having a mind is to enable an organism to respond flexibly to a complex and changing environment, and on the basis of knowledge of the environment. I mean, there's no particular biological value in having beliefs about the environment if they're completely wrong. But so I think, as it were, the kind of case where things are functioning well for an organism with a mind is where it's acting on what it knows about the environment, and then the cases of belief that fall short of knowledge are really cases where it's acting on something that and so it's as it were, it's treating it, by acting on it, it's treating it as if it were knowledge, but in fact because it's been this internal state has been brought about in the wrong sort of way. It's not knowledge, it's a belief, either maybe a false belief or at least a belief that falls short of knowledge because it wasn't maybe formed in the right reliable way. And so it's that kind of picture of mind as in right from something whose, as it were, whole function is to be attuned to the environment in the way that we can call knowledge. I think that picture has given the view that I was pushing in the book quite a lot of robustness. I think one of the ways in which the view has become more mainstream with one that I hadn't especially expected, but although I did have a hope in this direction, which was that it turns out that it's not just that that there are theoretical reasons for taking knowledge to be first, but that I mean, there's lots of evidence that that's in fact the way that human beings develop, that children understand the distinction between believing and between knowing and not knowing well before they understand the idea of a belief, which could be either true or false. And even in animal ethology now, there's quite a lot of evidence that non-human animals are actually working with a distinction which is something like that between knowing and not knowing, that even monkeys and so on need to work with that way, and it's not so mysterious why that should be. I mean, if you're hiding, for example, from a predator, then the point of hiding is that the predator should not know where you are. And so in some way, just in order to hide, you have to have some kind of primitive conception of the knowledge of another creature that you're trying to prevent.
Yeah, and I agree with you, because like you have the result of the false belief test, and that's something more difficult
Yes.
to have in mind, that somebody can have a false belief, right? And that's something that a lot of animals can do, although I agree with you that many animals should be able to deal with knowledge, but maybe not with false beliefs.
Yeah. I mean, there's considerable evidence to that effect has accumulated in the last 20 years.
Okay, so I didn't read Overfitting and the heuristics in philosophy, okay? So I'm here trying to look for a little bit of a spoiler. So can you explain a bit about what you referred to as the problem of overfitting in philosophy, and how it's related to the notion of heuristics in cognitive sciences, and how it would be responsible to some paradoxes that plague our field?
Yeah. So first of all, so overfitting and heuristics, these are two very separate ideas, but I do build a bridge between them. So overfitting is a kind of pathology that is well known to scientists in both the natural and social sciences, and has to do with people overcomplicating models, but introducing too many parameters in the models, in order to accommodate data, so that they're as it were, the idea is that the model is supposed to fit a whole lot of data that we have about some phenomenon that we're trying to understand, and one way to respond to any lack of fit between the model and the data is by making the model more complicated. And sometimes you just have to do that, otherwise you're not going to get anywhere. But people for whom as it were, that's the kind of default way of dealing with any kind of mismatch between data and theory. They go off on a sort of a very anti-progressive line where their model keeps getting more and more complicated, and it fits the current data, but then as soon as new data comes along, you get another failure of fit, and the model has to become even more complicated, and you just don't end up with anything explanatory or even predictively correct. And part of what's going on is that the data will inevitably include some errors, and so you're trying to fine-tune the theory to partly erroneous data, and so that you're never going to get a full match. And you know, in a kind of more maybe intuitive way, what you end up with is a situation in which you're really only getting out of the model what you put into it yourself, and so that it means that you end up not really learning anything from a model. So and you know, I think, although of course in philosophy you don't have the kind of theories that, you know, are data fitting in the way that you can get when you have large amounts of quantitative data. In fact, there is a similar phenomenon in philosophy to, well, I mean, it is a case of overfitting, where, for example, when people have been producing analyses of, you know, philosophical ideas like knowledge or meaning or causation or whatever, and then people come up with counterexamples, and then they complicate the analysis a bit, and then there are more counterexamples, and they complicated it still more, and so that's that's the form that overfitting has taken in philosophy. I think you can even find it in logic, where people have been complicating their logics and the kind of models, the logic models that they're using in order to accommodate data in the form of examples or counterexamples or whatever. And so I think overfitting is actually quite recognizable in philosophy. And of course, part of the trouble with overfitting is that if you have erroneous data, because then you're trying to fit to bad data, and then the way I'm using the category of heuristics is as an explanation of how we come to have bad data in philosophy. And so heuristics, that's the idea of methods of solving problems which are right most of the time and are quite easy to use, but you know, the price of them being easy to use is that they're not 100% reliable. And I mean, this is something that psychologists are very, very familiar with and study all the time. You know, an example of a heuristic built into our perceptual systems is that we take the boundaries between colors in the visual field as indicating the edges of physical objects out there in the environment, and we know that's not 100% reliable because camouflage in warfare exploits the fallibility of this heuristic for identifying the edges of physical objects. And what I'm arguing in the book is that a lot of the data that we have in philosophy, especially from thought experiments, although not only from them, is actually generated by heuristics, and that once you identify what the heuristics are, you can see that these heuristics cannot be 100% reliable because they're actually inconsistent in some ways, and so that's how we're getting the in some cases bad data that philosophers are then using to motivate moving away from simple theories to something more complicated, and so that is what's making the problem of overfitting so serious in philosophy. And so an example of some kind of heuristic that I think we use all the time is that we just a heuristic along the lines that small changes don't matter, that we can, if a change is very small, we can ignore it, and that's something that in a way it's for practical reasons we have to do all the time, that we can't be constantly updating everything, and so for example, we if we just in maintaining a database, we won't be constantly checking that the information that we have, let's say, about people's addresses is still correct, and so if you have a heuristic of that kind, which is telling you to ignore small differences, you're going to end up with for example, the Sorites paradox of the heap, and where if you just take one grain away from a heap, you still get a heap, supposedly. So that's what we assume, because we treat that as such a small difference that we can afford to ignore it. But then, of course, if you start off with a heap with 10,000 grains, if you take them away one by one, you will eventually get down to just 3 grains, and then 2, and then 1, and you're still calling it a heap. So that, in my view, the philosophical paradoxes like the Sorites paradox, they're really just the result of philosophers ingeniously exploiting a quite practical heuristic that we have of ignoring small differences, and they're finding ways to turn that into a philosophical paradox. And and the reason that it's so difficult to deal with for philosophers is because there's nothing that's sort of telling us that what we're using is just a heuristic. I mean, the heuristics don't have a kind of health warning printed on the front of them.
Okay, so just that we can make some closure on this, like the main part of the interview. So do you think that the use of impossible worlds that is a trend right now is example of this kind of overfitting?
Yes, yes, I think it is, and the reason is that in the way that overfitting is often defined by scientists is that it's giving yourself too many degrees of freedom, where a degree of freedom is an extra kind of parameter, an extra moving part that you can vary. And so the thing with impossible worlds, as they're generally understood these days, is that whereas with possible worlds as traditionally understood, there are all kinds of constraints about what's true in a possible world that correspond to the principle of semantic compositionality. That's, well, it's very important in semantics, where, for example, if P and Q, that conjunction can only be true at a given world if P is true at the world and also Q is true at the world, and P or Q can only be true at a world if either P is true at the world or Q is true at the world. Whereas with impossible worlds, all those constraints are abandoned, and basically you can just choose any arbitrary set of sentences to be the ones that are true at a given world. And the effect of that, when you analyze it, is that whereas traditionally as it were, the parameters that you're dealing with just correspond to the atomic sentences, and then I mean, in defining a world, you're considering what the which atomic sentences will be true at that world. But then from then on, it's determined just by the sort of compositional rules which complex sentences are true at that world. Whereas with impossible worlds, there's no such constraint that each complex sentence is its own degree of freedom, because you can't tell from the way that a complex sentence is made up and what's true in terms of its parts, whether it will be true or false at the given world. So that as it invoking impossible worlds is in effect a gross multiplication of the degrees of freedom, and I think it in philosophy, as in science, it has the same kind of bad effect, that it means that, roughly speaking, all we get out of a model is what we put into it by hand. You don't have the thing that really enables you to learn from a model in science, where the model is relatively simple. You just have to put in, you specify a few parameters, and then you turn the handle and see how the model works. And so I think that impossible worlds, in effect, they're a gross example of overfitting.
Okay,
Okay,
thank you. So as we can finish the interview, I'll do a last question and leave Jose with a last one too. It's not like a theoretical question. So if you were to list like 5 works, philosophical or not, that you think that are important for a philosopher, like somebody that is approaching philosopher right now, to read, what those would be? It can be for any time, and it's not any kind of ranking. It's just 5 works that you think it's important.
Yeah. So if I was to think in terms of the most important philosophers, then I guess number one on my list would be Plato. But I find the question difficult, because if one was talking about which books have been most influential in philosophy, then for example, Kant's critique of pure reason would obviously be one of the ones that you would need to mention. On the other hand, if it was a matter of making recommendations to somebody who wanted to read some books to get into philosophy, then I think that would be a completely disastrous recommendation, because it's a notoriously baffling book, and it's completely the wrong place to start. So I mean, I guess in a way this is it's also the same thing with a lot of modern science, that that there aren't really the 5 books that you have to read or anything like that. And I think in a way we probably need to get away from the kind of great man theory of the history of philosophy, because although of course there are some great philosophers, but I think what that sort of conceals is the extent to which philosophy is actually a collective enterprise. And I mean, this is something that has been brought home to me when I was writing modal logic as metaphysics, that when you actually look at the history of modal logic, you see how many people were in fact involved in making contributions, and the greatest modal logicians were building on things that had been done before, and not always done by the people who are now so well remembered. So I mean, so I'm actually very reluctant to give a list of 5 books like that.
Okay, I believe that your talk about the role of collective work is even more important than specific books. So José, left with you.
Professor Danilo. Professor Kim, this question is off the topic conversation, but it's very necessary. So what is the importance of logic and philosophy to deal with modern problems like AI, conspiracy theories, and fake news?
Well, I mean, I don't think that logic, unfortunately, can provide any kind of silver bullet that will kill conspiracy theories or whatever. I mean, of course, if a conspiracy theory is inconsistent, if it contradicts itself, then that's we're using logic to see a problem with it. But of course, there are many conspiracy theories which are logically consistent, but are nevertheless complete total rubbish, and that one should be able to a reasonably informed person should be able to see a total rubbish. So that I don't, unfortunately, I don't think that logic by itself it has very much power to deal with problems like that. I mean, of course, it's true that the computers themselves came out of a problem in logic, and it was work in logic in the 1930s that led to basically the invention of the computer, and the computer is what's enabled the AI to develop. But a lot of the techniques that are used in AI are ones that have more to do with statistics than they have to do with logic. So it's a bit like thinking that because physics is involved in the building of nuclear weapons or something, that physicists should be the ones to bring about world peace or something. That and I think a lot of the solutions have got to be political ones rather. So although logic is somewhere there in the foundations, it just learning some logic isn't going to help you shoot down conspiracy theories, alas.
Professor Tim, thank you very much. It was a pleasure talking to you, Danilo. Mia.
Well, thank you for your interesting questions.